Welcome. This is one of our first interviews from San Francisco, and we are joined today by Tyler from Continue.dev.
Hey,
thanks. It's going great. How are you?
I'm doing pretty good. It's Friday, so it's a lovely afternoon here, and I'm excited to have this chat with y'all.
And you have the most perfect office,
I
think.
It's amazing.
In the city center of San Francisco. Yeah. It's amazing.
There's like the park over there. I don't know the name, but
Salesforce Park.
Salesforce Park, yeah.
Okay, they coined the park. Cool.
Well, they funded it, so then they get to name it what they want, right?
Interesting. It's a pretty cool space. Thank you for joining us, for finding time to chat with us today. Yeah. And today the idea would be to talk about LLMs, AI and LLMs for coding specifically. So before we start, maybe Ty, could you tell us a little bit more about you, about your journey into programming, into AI, how it all started from the very beginning?
Yeah, definitely. I've only learned this recently, but it turned out my grandma actually worked on mainframes, like punch cards.
Oh, really?
She was a computer, like when they called women like computers, right? And then my mom, out of college, actually programmed in COBOL. But by the time I came around, both of them were so far removed from computing. I never knew this until actually the last couple of years. And so when I went to university, it was the first time I'd interacted with programming, and took like an introductory course my freshman year. And
which programming language do you
C++.
use? C++, okay.
To Michigan, they start you with C++. And the final project was like a n-gram project where like you would look in song lyrics for tokens where it's like this token, this token, this token are commonly found, right? 3 of them. So that would be a 3-gram n-gram, right? Yeah. And they're 2-gram and a single gram. And we just generated Christmas music using that. And I was like, wow, this was my introduction to kind of AI on a technical level, right? I think even prior to that, like about 10 years ago, I'd philosophically been interested in the idea of AI. And this is, I guess, almost 9 or 8 years ago that I started programming, and then got super interested in the intersection of language and computation. So I studied cognitive science with a focus in computation, very much focused on adaptive computation. And then that kind of led me to NLP, machine learning, AI. And particularly, I got really deep into dialogue management systems. And so at the time, right, it would be a state machine where in the background, it was just like trying to figure out all the possible conversations you might have and represent that in a graph. And so I had the idea that bringing dialogue or machine learning to dialogue management was going to be the future. And so worked at a research lab turned company while in my senior year, and ended up joining Rasa in Berlin, which was building the open source machine learning framework for conversational interfaces.
Which year was it?
That was 2019. So that's like the halfway in my journey, right? So I learned and kind of got up to speed, and then I'd been working as a software engineer, machine learning engineer, and they gave me the opportunity to move to Berlin from the US and be the first product manager. So my users were developers, we were building an open source framework, and I was working closely with the research team.
Interesting. And what was the first time you stumbled on LLMs? I mean, what was the transition? Yeah, I mean,
2018 when GPT came out, right?
Just after it came out.
Yeah, so they did like a stage release where it was like they thought, it's kind of funny now, right? But they thought it could potentially be dangerous at the time. So they like did a like increasingly larger release, right? Because they were worried about misinformation and ethical kind of implications. And so it was fun to watch each one drop and then be able to go and play and use it, right? And at the time it was nowhere near what we see with GPT-4, but it was still like a huge breakthrough compared to the previous approaches that we were taking.
Right. So you've mentioned the misinformation, and I'm wondering, maybe I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but about the ethical consequences of AI. What do you think about that?
It's a really tough question. I think there's awesome kind of research going on and people far smarter than me kind of working on it. Kind of where my view goes is like, I'm a believer that we don't really quite have the right vocabulary at the moment, where I think technology has outpaced philosophy of technology. And so concepts like AGI or consciousness or sentience, those things are so blurred that it's really difficult to have conversations about like the ethics if you go that far into the future, that we kind of need a lot of philosophy to be done, right? Or research to be done in that direction, I think, to help catch us up. That said, I think there's a ton of implications of if you just deploy LLMs, right, without thinking about how they might spread information or lead to abuse or like those kinds of things, that we definitely need to set guardrails, right? But also do it like we saw yesterday at the Olama meetup, right? In a thoughtful way where we're still empowering developers, right? We're not allowing any particular centralized authority to determine what those guardrails should be, but at the same time also not deploying uncensored models to teenagers, I think was the example.
I think if we stick to open source model, it will be okay, right? If everything stays open in a way, instead of like.
That's a good question, right? I hope, right? I think I think sunlight is a great disinfectant, right? Where I think the world's developers, I believe in them, right? And that ultimately they will use open source LLMs for good, and that they will use them for positive outcomes. That said, right, it's always a double-edged sword with any technology where you're opening it up for people to use it in negative ways or abuse.
Yeah, it almost feels like we are getting a bit political here. So
yeah, but today we are. So today you are working on your own project, right? It's called Continue.
Correct. Yeah.
Continue.dev. And could you tell us more about it? And,
yeah, definitely. So yeah, kind of being very early with LLMs, I spent a lot of time thinking and playing with them. So like when Codex dropped, right, it was like a beta originally. It's the model that is the original model that powered GitHub Copilot. I think they've made some improvements now, and it might not be Codex. They haven't publicly said, but originally it was the model, and it was for Python. And so got early access for the Rasa engineers, and we were generating like SDK code for our Python framework. And it was like at that point where I was like, wow, you could see the potential, but it wasn't that useful at that time. And so just kind of during that time started to do side projects with my now co-founder, Nate, who's coding in the back. Audience can't see, but it's the important thing about startups. You gotta always be coding. Somebody at least has to always be coding.
Moving fast.
Someone has to be doing all the work, right?
Yeah, exactly. And so, yeah, we just started playing with side projects. And what we kind of noticed is that as we did more and more side projects, we kept using GitHub Copilot, Codex, GPT-3, DaVinci, right, more and more. And then when ChatGPT dropped, it became really clear, right, that
that's the way.
Yeah, with RLHF, it really showed like, okay, this is going to be transformative, right, beyond even code, but I think especially, and as we've seen, I think first and foremost, often code or software development. And so we ended up, our next side projects were using kind of LLMs for coding. So we tried everything from like building agents to generating unit tests to starting with a stack trace, could we help you debug? And the last side project was kind of an open source GitHub Copilot. And we got into Y Combinator with it, and I decided to move back to San Francisco. My co-founder graduated from MIT a year early, and then we moved to San Francisco and
to focus on this.
Exactly, to focus on this. It's been 9 months. So.
Interesting. So Continue is very, very interesting because when we talked behind the scenes, there's this idea that, with Copilot, you send the query or you generate some like a question, but it's closed, right? It's sent to some provider, and you don't see anything that happens in between. So you don't gather this data. And with Continue is different, right?
And you don't know anything about the model in Copilot.
It's just like a black box in a way. And here you're doing something different.
Yeah, exactly. I think you guys are right on the money. The important thing to understand about any of these Copilot systems, but especially the ones in the software development domain, is that the models, it's not like a single model. It's not like GPT-4 is running everything. It's what the Berkeley Artificial Intelligence Research Lab calls a compound AI system. And so it's a series of components. You have a chat model that's often like a GPT-4 or a DeepSeek Coder 33 billion if you want to use open source. You have the tab autocomplete model, which is usually between 1 and 15 billion parameters. And then you have the re-ranking model and the embeddings model, and you have a filtering component and the local context engine and a server context engine. And so what our kind of thesis is that there's a lot of value in enabling developers to, one, understand that system, make it transparent, but then also enabling them to optimize and customize each of those components, whether it's the models or the filtering component or the context engines, that in the future, we're going to all build our own AI software development systems, right, which will be kind of the next generation to come after these current Copilots.
That will be highly adapted to a specific case, right?
Exactly. So if you're in an organization, right, as you kind of use the system, you're generating a lot of data that could be used to improve the system. And so we're seeing a lot of enterprises actually adopt Continue and roll it out to their developers because it lets them keep their data.
I was reading your blog post before this interview, and you mentioned this transition. In the past, we used manuals, right? You had those like man pages, and you had to go through them to find the information you want, and you had to like read through all of like a lot of pages. Yeah. And then we transitioned to Google and searching things, and Stack Overflow came next, and now we have LLMs. But it's still like closed, as we discussed with Copilot, and Continue is like the next step, right? It's like the
we hope.
yeah, but it's the idea sounds amazing. And could you elaborate on that, on this transition from like
Yeah, I mean, it's mostly just like, I think building startups is a lot about like listening to users and talking to them and hearing feedback. And it's especially the people who are learning to program now, like the way that they're learning is so much different than the way that I learned, let alone the way that the people before me came. And it just, they are existing in a world where ChatGPT, where GitHub Copilot, where these other AI software development systems are necessary and allow them to like very much learn faster, I think, right? Understand things at a deeper level than like I probably did at the time when I was kind of learning. And so we're just seeing a lot of behavior where previously you would, like you were saying, go to Google and search and ask Stack Overflow, where the first instinct is to try asking ChatGPT or Copilot or Continue. And as a result, right, maybe you fall back when you're like, oh, I think this thing might be hallucinating. I think there's still a lot of value in like Google search and Stack Overflow and even reading man pages or going to the docs for things. But what we're seeing is the first step is actually ask an LLM.
Yeah, it's easier to kickstart, right?
But also LLMs help you actually to read the docs. You give man page to an LLM and ask it to summarize, for example.
Yeah, so we actually have this concept of what we call context providers in Continue, where you can plug in your own kind of context. And so one is a docs context provider, right, where you can actually copy a link of a public docs, most are, right? So if you want to use Next.js, for example, right, you can just copy the docs for that framework. You can put the link in, it will index all of those docs. And then when you're programming and learning Next.js for the first time, you can go at Next.js and then ask your question, and it will use RAG like you're describing to pull in the right context from the docs and give you an answer. And this is really critical for models where the knowledge cutoff date is like a year or two ago, because like a Next.js has so many new features in the last year or two. And so to supplement that is really critical, especially during the learning process.
Yeah, every week there's something new and you need to catch up.
Yeah, I wanted to ask one more question, but kind of to take a step back from tech aspects, and want to ask a bit about marketing, maybe, or business model of the Continue. Because, well, Continue is competition to GitHub Copilot. It's supposed to help developers. So I'm wondering, what are the advantages of using Continue against Copilot, for example?
Yeah, so Continue is not a black box. It's something that you can kind of understand. So that's kind of the first step. It's nice because Apache 2.0 licensed open source code. You can go read it. When you get a suggestion that you don't know why it was this way or it's wrong or bad, you can at least go try and figure out why the system decided to give you that suggestion, which I think is already amazing. But I think the step further that I think we're beginning just in the early days of enabling is you can then actually do something about when you get a bad suggestion or a wrong suggestion. So I think all of us have our own definition of like, what is the right way to build software, what great software is. And so we need to be able to shape our models and shape our compound AI system to be able to make sure they're giving us suggestions we want, right? That we think are the right way, that we think will lead to great software. And so with GitHub Copilot, you just kind of get the suggestion. If it's not something you like, you can't do anything about it, where we believe in a world where if you get a suggestion you don't like, you should be able to do something about it. And there's many things you can do, but we're very, very much in the early days of learning what those are, what are the ones that work really well, what are the ones that we can make more easily accessible to developers, especially if you're just learning.
So the feedback loop, right?
Yeah.
And I think Copilot is more generic, right, in a way. I'm not sure if that's the proper word. But for example, when you work with like big companies, they have like legacy code bases, right? And they have their own ways of creating software, their own practices, their own processes. If I understand correctly, we could capture that if we can adapt the model to the way the organization is set up, right?
Yeah, exactly. So what we're kind of seeing is like, as you use large language models, a byproduct is you're creating a lot of data. You're showing kind of how you actually take certain steps to create, ultimately a Git commit, right? But you're kind of starting to shine some light on like what happened in between the Git commits. And so as you're using the LLM, you need to gather a lot of context to give to the LLM so that it makes the right decision. So if you're in an org that has a very specific way to do microservices or docs or different things like that, right? You need to make sure you give that as context to the model so it does it in the way that you want. But if you actually had access to the model, there's like a number of techniques like fine tuning, domain adaptive continued pre-training, or maybe even pre-training from scratch. So like OpenAI, for example, will train you a custom model. At the moment, it starts at $2 to $3 million, but they'll take GPT-4's training data and combine it with your billions of tokens from your company, right? And train you a model that codes more like you, that understands kind of your organization's history. And so we think taking that data that you've collected in the past, like your Jira tickets, your Confluence docs, is really critical, but also starting to collect the data you generate by using LLMs. We call this development data, and actually use that to set yourself up in the future. Maybe right now you don't fine tune or domain adapt your models, but we think in the future you will.
So the keyword could be amplify, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Amplify developers and
exactly. Yeah, we believe in a future where developers are amplified, not automated, right? I think it's unfortunate. I don't know why this is happening, but we're seeing so many AI dev tools, which are really cool and amazing, but so many of them are positioning themselves as like the superhuman AI engineers. And I think what we're seeing is for very generally more junior folks are getting scared, right? Because they don't feel like they're going to have a job, right? And then for more senior folks, they're kind of annoyed because they know that they can dig into the demos and realize that they're lies, right? Or there's lots of falsehoods in it. And so they're kind of annoyed, right? And so we're trying to create a counter narrative that's about empowering developers. And so we believe in amplifying them. So similar to when we moved from assembly to higher level programming languages or from text editors to IDEs, we saw just more power, right? And there was more developers. It's going to be easier. There's going to be more developers. Like I think we're in the very early innings of how much of the world and how much of what we do as humans in terms of automation. And so I think it's just going to grow, and the amount of people who are coding and are able to code as a result of LLMs is just going to increase.
So you mentioned context, like a keyword as well, and you mentioned, for example, you can like you can use some like a piece of documentation. But with Continue, you can also use issues, right, or pull requests. There is like all sort of like a lot of different ways you can provide context for a specific task.
Exactly. So those are examples of other context providers, right? Where you can at a particular issue, or you can at.
And this way you can amplify, for example, the developer. And another way you're doing, which I find pretty interesting, is that you mentioned that just before, but maybe we could repeat that because this is a super interesting idea, that there is a lot of things that happen in developers' heads, right? When you're working on a
inner monologue.
Yeah, inner monologue. And the idea would be maybe, is there a way to capture that? And
yeah, this is actually not my original idea. It's Andrej Karpathy, I think, tweeted about it a couple of weeks ago. But the basic premise, he was like trying to think about what would be the ideal training data for LLMs. Today, it's been trillions of tokens from the internet, right? Which there's lots of examples of kind of thinking and reasoning going on and how humans respond to certain things, which has led to these amazing models that we have. But if we had data about kind of like what was going on in your head, right, especially as you built software, where it's like software is not built in one dramatic step. It's like you write something, like you try to run it, it fails, you take the error, right? Today you Command-Shift-R and continue, and it explains to you what the error is. Previously, you would go to Google and search what that error was. But being able to capture more and more of that is something that we're very focused on at Continue. And because we're open source, it's not like we're collecting it. Many of the closed source providers collect that data, and you're unaware that they're collecting it, or you just don't care that they're collecting it. But what that means is you're just not set up in the future. They generally use it to improve things on average across all of their users, but you're not able to kind of use it to improve for yourself or for your team or for your organization. So we're very much focused on that piece. We think this data is going to be so critical for making better models in the future that giving developers the choice of how they pool their data with other developers will be critical.
I'm wondering, because you said that the inner monologue would be a perfect material to train LLMs.
Remember, Andrej Karpathy said this.
Yeah. So you quoted Andrej Karpathy. I'm wondering, what do you think about some kind of implants or chips that you put in your brain, like Neuralink, for example? I don't want to derail this interview, but
good. I have a succinct answer. I've thought a lot about this because my background's in cognitive science, which is very adjacent to not only AI but also neuroscience. I think that there's a lot of promise in being able to read from the brain. I think the early signs that you're able to write to the brain, and would we even want that, are not there. So, I saw the demo from Neuralink about like playing chess and things like that, and it looked really cool. But that's about as far as I can probably go, given my background, where from what I know from the literature, it's going to be, you might be able to like read thoughts, but to be able to write thoughts, which I think will be critical for being able to have an interface you can use, that feels further off.
You have like a full cycle, right? Are there any projects that are interesting for you right now, except maybe what you're working on, like things that caught your eye and you find them super interesting?
Yeah, I think like the SWE agent. Have you like come across this? So like I think 6 or 9 months ago, I was digging into benchmarks, and I found the SWE benchmark, where they try and take open source projects or kind of issues that were closed with PRs, and they use that to gather a benchmark to evaluate models. Because if you think about what human eval is, which is often the one that like people focus on, especially like in the R local llama community, it's actually 164 Python programming problems, right? Which are not representative of software development. So they're like, what would be more representative? And so they're like, oh, like literally real world examples
Open
from
source.
GitHub.
Yeah.
And so they created this, and then the models themselves, like when they tested GPT-4 and Claude 3, they got like 1%, right? And so that's usually a good sign for a benchmark where the models don't do very well because it gives a new goal, right, for people to improve. And the SWE agent, I believe, is from the same group who created it out of Princeton. And they were able to go from like 1 or 2% to like 12.5% performance in terms of being able to do agent-like tasks. So we tend to call them more async workflows, and I think they have a lot of promise, but very far off, I think.
That sounds pretty interesting.
Amazing.
Are there any projects like you use, like AI projects that you use for fun, like for music or something like that? I mean, do you believe in that AI could replace musicians in the past, or graphic designers, or maybe amplify them?
Yeah, I think they'll be amplified. It's probably a theme of what I believe, right? But I think if I think about like what moves me, right? Like why do I engage with media or art or those kind of things? It's about like an emotional connection to other humans, other people, right? And so maybe the models would be able to capture that and present it to me. But I think at least for me, like I really view the being able to connect with the humans, even if I've never met them and they're somewhere across the planet, but to know that they're people and that they're going through the same human experience. I think that's the hard part about LLMs is they seem to show like lots of evidence that they experience the human experience, but I don't think they do, at least as of right now, right? And so at least for me, I'm more of a consumer of human-made art. That said, I think human-made art with the use of tools, right, to do iterations faster, right, or
brainstorm ideas, right?
Exactly. I think there's a lot of promise in that.
If you were to give an advice to junior developers right now, who, like you said, you've mentioned that some of the, blogs or articles, they're just scared of the AI coming, right? Replacing junior developers. Yeah. So what would be your advice to them?
Well, number one, use Continue, right? Like, of course. But use LLMs in general, even if you don't use Continue, because I just think that in many ways, I think what we're going to see is like people that are so-called junior developers actually catch up to senior developers and like really lead the way in terms of how do you leverage LLMs, right? Because we kind of have these two things happening right now. Like model capabilities are getting a lot better, but then also developers are learning to use LLMs more. And so it's really not necessarily like junior, senior. It's more how open-minded are you? And so if you're open-minded about learning like ways you can automate things that are repetitive, that you don't like doing using LLMs, the more you're able to do that and embrace that kind of future, I think the more likely that you'll end up being able to be a strong contributor wherever you decide to
That's an interesting way of phrasing it. And I think with Continue, you can like tinker with the tool, right? It gives you some more flexibility, I would say.
So this is really fundamentally what we mean by amplified developer is we think that developers are ultimately going to choose the option that offers them a path forward. So if you use like a closed source system and you start to automate more of your job, eventually, if you follow that long enough, right, and if the models continue to get better, you have no job. Where if your job is like learning to automate your job using LLMs, you just start to shift more and more of your work to building the AI software development system. And so maybe we get to a future where all developers do is point the AI developer system in a direction, but I think that they'll, for at least a very long time, if not forever, there'll be developers around a table arguing about what to have the AI software development system do next. Right, and there's a lot of steps and a lot of hard work to get to there. But I think building that system and maintaining that system and improving that system is going to become a core competency of many developers, if not all developers.
Tyler, thank you very much for the interview.
Yeah,
it was fun.
It was perfect.
Yeah.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you for having us.
To the office.
And, showing us the office. And good luck with the project. And check out the Continue.dev and see you in the next one.
Thank you.
Cheers.